What's going on, everyone? So it is that time. We've got another tier list. I know, all of your favorites. These ones are pretty big because we are ranking every single deck in the meta realistically. Each leader is going to be represented by one or multiple decks if they are worth talking about. Now, as I have done these lists, my list has gotten bigger and bigger, not just because there have been more leaders added to the game, but because of how many leaders actually have a couple different decks that do reasonably well. So I've gotten a lot stricter, and I have limited to really focusing on decks that are worth talking about outside of the one deck that really represents that leader. There may be a few others in here. A perfect example of this would be something like OG Han Blue, right? OG Han Blue is still a very good deck, and you could argue that it could be a B or A tier deck, but it's not going to be on here because it is still quite a bit worse than the other options Han has. So we got a lot stricter. We have at least one list for every single leader on the options that you have for Star Wars Unlimited, and then some that just really overperform and thus have options multiple that are worth talking about. This is going to give us a good spread, and of course we're going to be looking at the power level of the deck. And so you may see a lot of different results because I'm kind of going about this a little bit of a different way in terms of really limiting the decks, because eventually we're going to have, hundreds and hundreds of lists to talk about, especially when we get to like the 5 or 6 sets in any given rotation, which is going to be insane. And so before we dive into each individual list or each individual leader with their corresponding lists, let's talk about the tiers and where we're situating these leaders. So because this is a deck tier list rather than a leader tier list, we're going to be evaluating the power level of the deck. How awesome, how consistent, how explosive, etc., etc., etc. What are the results of these lists and ranking them? So S tier are going to be the meta decks, and this should be no surprise to basically any of you. We've talked about the S tier decks. These are going to be decks like Sabine, no surprise, that are consistently doing well and the decks to really beat. A tier, these are going to be the decks that, while performing well and performing consistently, they're not quite as dominant and widespread as the S tier lists. Both S tier and A tier have a very good competitive chance at doing well in tournaments, but A tiers are not going to be the decks to beat, which honestly can give you a little bit more of an edge because it might be something that, well, other players might not be expecting. B tier lists, these are what I like to call the showdown lists, the Friday night Star Wars Unlimited lists. These are the ones that you're like, guys, I've just picked up this list, or I kind of theory crafted this list. I'm just looking to run in, play some games, and have some fun, well, albeit playing a reasonably interesting and powerful deck to where you still can win, and it's not like you're horribly disadvantaged, but you are disadvantaged a decent amount compared to your A and S tier lists. C tier, this is where we start to get to the point where I don't really see a whole lot of value, a whole lot of interest in playing these lists, either because the leader just doesn't synergize well and the overall deck just doesn't really function that well, or it's just so kind of mediocre that there's nothing calling to it. This also can contain some very, very niche decks that have really good matchups, but also in a lot of situations are just going to falter. D tier, this is where we get to the list where I just don't really see options for you to consistently win. You can absolutely pull out wins, and I'll say 100% every single list here can pull out wins. You can even top a planetary qualifier with basically any list here, and we've seen a lot of random ones pop up. Ones that aren't even on today's lists because, at least from the experience I've had, are still weaker than some other counterparts within that leader's options. But that just goes to show you that D tier while there are lists that are going to give you a serious disadvantage and may not have really much appeal to be, I guess, playing that list, you still have options for it. With all that said, we're going to be diving into this with alphabetical order. This is also a new addition. If you're curious, I will leave timestamps for every single leader. I have also gone ahead and gone with the original arts, which was another thing that a lot of people mentioned. And on top of all of that, I will try to add the leader when we're talking about them above my head, so you can go ahead, or somewhere on the screen, so you guys can go ahead and follow along, because I know some of you are on phones and it can be hard to see some of the leaders. Let's dive in to Ahsoka Tano. Starting us off, we've got, well, a reasonably interesting one. And I may adjust these leaders as we kind of go through the tier list, as we get more on the list and are bumped down or bumped up accordingly. But a good starting place for Ahsoka, I believe, is going to be around the low B tier, maybe high C tier range. Ahsoka Yellow is going to be the go-to list for Ahsoka generally. One of the big things with Ahsoka is that you kind of want a lot of units on the battlefield. And while you can do this in Ahsoka Green, heck, you can even run like droid manufacturing, Ahsoka Yellow oftentimes is just a little bit more powerful. You get Plo Koon, you get a couple of access to some early space units, you get access to your Millennium Falcon, and alongside all of that, you still get access to Ahsoka, and if you are able to trigger that coordinate, you can do some pretty powerful things, such as go ahead and deploy Ahsoka, get a Plo Koon down, and you've got a 5/6 and a 6/6, one of them ambushing and the other one just being able to attack, and that can be pretty powerful as a leader option. So Ahsoka gonna end up in the B tier. There are a few things holding her back, like coordinate isn't always easy to trigger, and your opponent knows it's coming. And on top of all that, it's just not as consistent and powerful even as some other options, even in the heroism, aggression, cunning archetype. Next up, we've got Anakin Skywalker. Now, this is one of the few lists that has two options for it, and I do believe this is worthwhile. Both of these lists are decently strong, but also both of them are decently represented on a popular scale as well as power scale in terms of planetary qualifier data. Anakin Blue is the superior option in my opinion, and this is going to end up in the A tier. Not quite as strong as some of the S tier options, as we've come to note, but still a powerful contender in its own right. As far as this versus Rey Red, which is kind of a similar archetype, I do find that Anakin does have a few more options, as well as the early value trading alongside the Anakin flip itself has good ways to end the game and good ways to stay on board. I do like those options for Anakin. Now, Anakin Blue, the reason why it tends to be a little bit more powerful is you do have the ability to get to the mid game where you are quite a bit stronger with things like Luke Skywalker, for example, and mainly Luke Skywalker. Anakin Green, though, is very powerful as well. And I have to put this probably at the more top end of B tier. It's not quite an A tier list for me, but Anakin with ECL or even 30 HP base, I've actually found some really, really interesting options with ECL. Even though it may seem like you're really running through your HP quickly, Anakin definitely makes that up, and you can run options to restore some of that HP, such as Sundari Peacekeeper, to really, really ramp up kind of what Anakin is capable of. But ECL with Podambrins, ECL with Wreckers after you deploy Anakin himself can always be very good, and you can always ECL early to remain present on the board, and then Anakin can be your finisher. Whereas Sabine kind of needs ECL to finish, Anakin can just use ECL to get to the finisher, which is Anakin. We've got Aphra up next, and this is, in my opinion, a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier with the C tier. A lot of the C tier options are just going to be kind of not that interesting, but more specifically, some of them have really, really strong game plans against certain decks and then fall apart against others. Aphra Blue is one of those decks. Aphra Blue, strong in terms of being able to be the ultimate control deck. You're able to really filter through your library by basically discarding your whole library and then shuffling the ones that you specifically want back into your deck, which makes it so that you have supreme choice over other control decks, generally speaking. And that's where the great matchup comes in. However, outside of that specific scenario, you're going to find yourself struggling against a lot of the early game aggro decks, or the decks that are looking to take advantage of your resources, Han, or decks that are just completely overrunning you and going wide, or hyper aggro decks that will go over that are trying to win on like turn 3. These options are really, really good at doing their game plan. And if your deck is kind of this deck to go long and really see its true potential later on in the game when you're able to recycle your library, well, you're not even going to get to that point in 99% of those games. And you have to add to the fact that Aphra herself also deploys as often a 2/5. And that's just not strong enough to recoup your options on the board, as opposed to some of the other control decks that we'll talk about in this video. Next up is Asajj, and although I am partial to Asajj yellow, it is clear as to what the vast majority of people are choosing to bring. And mind you, Tarkin Town is a fantastic option, and for that, Asajj is going to enter somewhere around the mid B tier area. Now, I've played a lot of Asajj, and I've played a lot of Asajj red as well as Asajj yellow. I'll say there are a lot of options that you have in terms of Asajj red. I've seen full on, now there are 2 of them decks. I've seen the triple dark raid decks. I've seen Tarkin Town versus non-Tarkin Town. I've seen, pure event decks where you're using the droid deployment, things like that. The way I found to be the most powerful and most consistent is making sure that you have a curve out in the first couple of turns. You really don't want to overload on events, and for that, you end up getting a really nice aggressive curve that can really take advantage of your opponent if they falter at any moment. The biggest problem with Asajj is that you have a lot of things that are really good against what you're trying to do, which is win the game quickly. There are decks that are going to be exhausting Asajj. You can't get in for that 5 damage. There's going to be decks that have Tarkin Town very frequently that can annihilate your early game units and then leverage a more powerful deck in the latter turns. There's going to be decks that, like Anakin, just can straight up kill your Asajj as she deploys as a normal unit. All of those things are absolutely relevant, and that's why she's in B tier, because at the end of the day, she is a hyper aggro deck for the most part, and Asajj coming down and attacking as a 4, or if you're playing Asajj yellow, a 5 powered leader. Granted, we're talking about Asajj red here specifically, but 4 powered leader going in and just absolutely smacking as early as turn 3 is very good. We've seen what things like Sabine or Kylo with an early deploy can do, and Asajj isn't really any different on that metric. It's just a matter of being able to consistently do that, and that's the issue for her. The only Boba Fett list that we've got in the meta right now is Boba Fett from set 2 yellow. This one's actually a pretty sweet list, and I'll have to hand it to Boba Fett. I actually have found this to be reasonably strong. This one is definitely more leaning into the tempo game plan, and I'll say Boba Fett got an extreme upgrade, as well as any cutting heroism in Plo Koon. And in Boba Fett's case, Plo Koon gets even more ridiculous. This is going to be a B tier list for me, kind of middle of the pack, maybe higher B tier, you could argue for it, but definitely a list that does get a lot better with set 3 from set 2. You have a lot more things with keywords. Coordinate is one of them, but as I said earlier, Plo Koon is a shining star in this list. He can come down as an ambusher with 7 power, assuming you have coordinate in your board, basically one-shotting everything that you could possibly imagine when he comes down. Add that to the fact that you've got really nice 7 resource plays to U-Wing reinforcement into, like Enfys Nest or Han Solo as an ambusher, also ambushing for 7 power. You're kind of just playing this disruptive, nice ambushing game plan, and then you're leveraging these more powerful units as you get later on the game, and that could be a really strong game plan. Ambushers, disruption, those are some of the strongest things that you can do, and Boba Fett does it a lot. Next one is one that I have not seen for quite some time, and that is Bo-Katan. Last time we talked about Bo-Katan on one of these lists, I actually had 2 lists up here, as well as, well, quite a few of these other leaders that we'll talk about today, and that's Bo-Katan Blue and Bo-Katan Red. Unfortunately, we haven't really seen either one at all in set 3. And on top of that, the only realistic results that we've seen have been from Bo-Katan Red. And I do find that to be slightly stronger, slightly more explosive potentially, but less consistent. Either way, this to me is more of a C tier list. Bo-Katan as a leader can be pretty decent, right? Just getting these 1 damage triggers everywhere, especially with like Tarkin Town, can be decent. And that's why she's going to end up in C tier. But the problem is that you're kind of forced into this Mandalorian strategy. You lose access to kind of a leader deploy compared to a lot of other leaders that are doing this Tarkin Town thing out there. You don't have as much early game presence, especially if you are going with those Mandalorians. And you can't even really take advantage of her leader ability without playing those Mandalorians that are generally slightly weaker than other options you have out there. This is one of those leaders that really, really just wants more options for her traits. Something like a Bo-Katan unit, the 3/3 on turn 1, is one of those units that really boosted her, and one of the reasons why double red Bo-Katan is as good comparatively to Bo-Katan Blue, because of simple additions to the Mandalorian pool like that. Of course, if we get more, I could see her rising. And I guess I said Tarkin Town is an extremely strong base, and that's part of the reason why she's just a little bit higher than your Bo-Katan Blues out there. This next one in Bossk has 2 very competitive lists, and this is one where I was talking with myself back and forth as to who I should put in S tier and who I should put in A tier. Does Bossk Blue go into S tier, or does Bossk Green go into S tier? And as I was looking, I was trying to look at metadata, I was trying to look at my own experiences and all that. And at the end of the day, in terms of where the meta shapes up, as well as results, Bossk Green has slightly more wins, but Bossk Blue is slightly more consistent, and both are extremely powerful. Here's the thing with Bossk Blue, it is a deck that people have to build around and build against, because it is the quintessential hard control deck in the meta. And for those reasons, I think I'm going to give the slight edge to Bossk Blue, but Bossk Green is literally right behind it, to be honest. I'd say Bossk Blue is just teetering on the kind of edge of S tier for me. Bossk Green, same thing. It is neck and neck where you should be placing these, and I would not fault anyone to swap these 2. Bossk Blue, as I mentioned, is the quintessential hard control list. It is the list that people have to build for. It is the deck that's going to be running basically all events, some small card draw, some bunches of healing, and then the end game finishers in Snoke's, Palpatine's, Avengers. One of the most powerful things about Bossk is that you get free removal while also getting value in your bounties, and then having a very early to deploy, as well as very well statted, for the most part, leader on 5. All those things improve its overall stats. This is a very consistent deck and is going to want to do, and often does, the same thing every single game. Bossk Green, on the other hand, is one of, if not the most explosive deck in the entire Star Wars Unlimited meta right now. Sabine Green and Han Yellow both have options as being one of the more explosive decks, but there is no one that can ramp and absolutely bury you like a Bossk Green can, in my experience. Options for double bounty hunters quarrying with a Bossk out, options just to get early game ramp into very early Darth Vaders and Crate Dragons. All of those things are very, very possible. And I've seen many games where game just feels impossible because on turn 1 your opponent's playing a unit and playing a bounty hunter's quarry, and then playing like another bounty hunter's quarry, and then gets 3 drops for 1 resource, so 9 resources worth of units for 3 resources, as well as more units being played as early as turn 4, and you're just completely overwhelmed and you get aggroed down. It can shift gears in that way from being this aggro deck to this more ramp, very, very hard to beat late game, and Bossk Green just does it very well. However, it is significantly less consistent in that way than a Bossk blue. And if you did find yourself up against a Bossk blue as a Bossk green, you are going to be a lot more sad because your bounties are going to have a lot less use than in other matchups. And an absolute banger gets followed up by another extremely strong couple of lists led by Cad Bane. Now this one isn't nearly as close of a debate, in my opinion, for the S versus A/B tier. I think there's a clear winner here, and that is going to be a Cad Bane red. Now, Cad Bane Tarkin Town is exceptional, but I do think it just slightly falls behind Bossk blue. I think both of these leaders, you could argue that Bossk should be an S tier and Cad Bane should be dropped into A tier. But in terms of overall stats, Cad Bane does slightly more performance than your Bossk green list. And honestly, Cad Bane is overall just an extremely powerful leader to combine with Tarkin Town. Early, just playing out your units combined with removing their units for essentially 0 resources is exceptional. Your opponent, if they play anything up to a 4 toughness unit on turn 1, assuming they're on the play and they played a unit, you can basically take out their unit on turn 1 every single time. And also, in often scenarios, you're going to find yourself with the initiative because your opponent doesn't want to play something on turn 1, which also gives you an advantage because you have initiative and you'll get use out of your Tarkin Town sometime during the game. It's also one of, if not the only list that can take advantage of one of the most powerful legendaries, and now there are 2 of them because it has such a nice 2-drop density for Underworld, as well as the 5-drop density for Underworld combination that allows you to play. Now there are 2 of them. Bossk blue is a lot different, whereas Cad blue is a lot different than Cad red. Cad red definitely dominates the early game and curves out. Cad blue, on the other hand, does oftentimes have some options for curving out, but more than not acts as a little bit more of a soft control option where you have Underworld cards and you're getting value from your pings, but you tend to go a lot longer in the game and do win with a lot more high cost units instead of curving out and using things like, now there are 2 of them to get an early game advantage alongside Tarkin Town. This one, I could definitely have an argument for B tier, and I could definitely see an argument for the A tier. In terms of performance, it is on par with Anakin green, but I just find myself a little bit more leaning towards Cad Bane blue in terms of their options and the strength of the overall list. But again, this is another one where you could easily swap Anakin and Cad Bane blue, and I don't think anyone would really argue in terms of the list right now. Next up, we've got Cassian yellow, and this one's a little bit of a tough one because, as I mentioned, we are rating the power level of decks, and so we saw Cassian yellow pop into the top 8s, but it's only a single list. And I also talked about earlier that there are a bunch of random lists popping into the top 8s. So I actually find aggression, cunning, heroism to be an extremely, extremely powerful archetype. And for that reason, there is merit to putting Cassian around the same area as Ahsoka Tano. And actually, in terms of overall performance, I found that Ahsoka could kind of be on the same level as Cassian in terms of overall performance. Cassian just a little bit more exciting because people want to run with Cassian over the Ahsoka, but Ahsoka deploys a little bit earlier, whereas this one gives you a little bit of card advantage and the option to deploy him with Saboteur. I'm actually going to put both of them in the C tier now that I think about it, because while looking at Cassian, I wouldn't feel right putting it in C tier, whereas Ahsoka's in B tier, because in terms of performance, although I find that Ahsoka Tano does perform reasonably well, and they are the exact same archetype for the most part, oftentimes both are running very space-heavy strategies, and then you have this leader that usually gets in maybe 1 attack. Well, Cassian just does it a little bit better because the drawing of cards actually is decent in a deck that's just running out a bunch of cheap space units and doing direct damage. But these are very close, and I think this is more representative of the aggression, heroism, cunning combination than any leader or even deck strength. This is just a fact of wow, Plo Koon's pretty good. You've got your A-Wings, which are pretty good, etc., etc., etc. Rebels are good. We knew this. I apologize in advance for any of you Chewie enjoyers, but this is going to be our first D tier list. This is one of those leaders where, yes, you can play the vigilance, command, heroism game plan, but in terms of what people are generally playing in that, Chewie just doesn't really offer a whole lot. Oftentimes when you're playing this strategy, you're running a few Sentinels on 3, and there are some situations where you can give Sentinel to some of your cheap units, but then Chewbacca as a leader comes down and oftentimes just gets killed by something. It can be a lot of different things at this point in the game. It could just get exhausted or bypassed by breaking in. It can get one-shot by Rival's Fall, or just a very beefy unit like an ECL'd Wrecker just hits this and overwhelms through. That's very, very common. And mind you, it deploys even later than a Wrecker could come down, assuming standard resource curve. So there are a lot of things really hindering Chewbacca. I think the biggest one is the fact that he deploys on 7 resources. If he deployed on 6, I could definitely see him jumping up a full tier, or potentially even a tier and a half, putting it like the bottom of B tier, because ramping to a very beefy Sentinel to completely overwhelm the ground and then him turning into a win condition by doing so is a very viable way of winning the game, as we'll see later on when we talk about a few other command, heroism, vigilance lists. We've got one of the OG classics in Chirrut Red, which has been kind of the original user of the Force synergy. Since then, we have basically seen absolutely zero Chirrut. Some people are going into the Chirrut Yellow area. Some people are sticking with the Chirrut Red. I still find the Force synergies to be good enough to play Chirrut Red over other options. But to be honest, everyone, this is a list I think has really fallen flat over the course of time. Yes, you can play red, blue Chirrut, and it's still okay, because you still play with Tarkin Town, just as like Anakin Blue will play. You still have the same kind of concept as Anakin Blue, but you're using a leader that has significantly worse actions. It has a very poor stat line and isn't the same win con or extending the game option as like a Rey Red. You just have a way worse option in your leader slot and doesn't do nearly as much. And for that, the deck just falls flat on its face, because a lot of the leaders or the color combinations just perform better. And as such, I think we're going to have to put Chirrut somewhere in the bottom of C tier. Yes, you could still force throw. Yes, you could do things like that. But my goodness, unfortunate Chirrut, you are just entering into a stage where Chirrut just doesn't really perform all that well. The fact that he could still be takedown is crazy to me, alongside, you know, when you're comparing it to Rey's or Anakin's or other options out there. Next up, we've got a list that, well, I think is worthy of like a very bottom B tier or even top of C tier in Dooku. Now, Dooku is one of those lists which is really, really tricky. You have this option to exploit out a bunch of different units, because you can exploit out any separatist. And there are some very, very powerful options that you can exploit out, such as the Dooku unit, such as the gunship. The devastating gunship can come out. You have a bunch of other options as well. But the problem is trying to get set up with that, especially in a meta with Tarkin Town. I think you could argue that this could be below sort of the heroism aggro, and we may adjust that based on some other options that we get as we go along. And to be honest, even now when I'm talking about it, I think just the heroism aggro shell just beats out Count Dooku. So I think I'm gonna have to swap these two. I know this Ahsoka's been drifting around, but Dooku Blue has some very powerful options, but it is that kind of niche deck where if you are kind of pushed out of the early game, you will never get your feet underneath you, never deploy these exploited really powerful cards that get immediate value, or in some cases you will, and you'll still get waylaid, you'll still get no good to me deaded or whatever it is. And Dooku does deploy really late on in the game, and that is one of its really big weaknesses. If this guy came down as like a 5 resource 4/6 or something like that to kind of hold the line while it's trying to exploit out these big things, you could have a lot more strength there. But unfortunately, you're going to find that Dooku, I said he could maybe make it at the bottom of B tier, but I just find that aggression, cunning, heroism just beats it out as an overall deck archetype. Speaking of cunning, aggression, heroism, we've got Fennec. And honestly, I think Fennec, of these ones that we've been talking about, Ahsoka, Cassian, and Fennec, actually puts her at the top. Aggression, heroism, cunning, heroism, these combinations are pretty good. You got the Rebel aggro package, you got the really powerful additions in Plo Koon, you've got the immediate readied up spaceship in Millennium Falcon. All of these things are lending itself to a very powerful game. Now, Fennec's ability kind of leans into that idea or identity better than any other ability on this list. Ahsoka's, yes, it can work out, but the ability to immediately get value from one of your units, whether it be a K2SO, whether it be just some random space unit or whatnot, from Fennec can really be a game changer in that mid game, whereas Ahsoka's ability generally doesn't get online, and while Cassian ability does do a little bit here and there, and he does deploy with a better stat line, which can go ahead and get in for some damage, Fennec, you kind of just use Fennec as I flip her, I attack for 4 because she has Saboteur, and I'm guaranteed to get in that damage, which is okay, and then she immediately dies, but you don't really care about that because you're just looking to get in damage, and you're going to get in that damage. Not to mention, and this is another addition to Fennec being just a little bit better than the Cassian and Ahsoka's, is that she can run Tarkin Town, and that is a pretty nice advantage over the other decks that are forced into 30 HP or Petronaki Arena bases, which is going to be a lot weaker. And I'm sure as we get deeper, we'll have to move down the other aggression, cunning, heroisms, maybe into the C tier, but not today because Finn is going into the D tier. This is another one of those lists where you really don't get any value from his action. His action's kind of like a dead action. There might be, if you're playing Finn Green, for example, which is the best archetype that I have found, you're going to be doing the inspiring mentor, maybe like the Rose Tico recycling experience and shields kind of game plan. But overall, these are kind of weird interactions that your opponent's most often not going to let you do, especially in a format with Tarkin Town. Tarkin Town makes this a lot more tricky, and you really don't get any advantage from Finn, with the exception of him being a 5 to deploy 4/6. That's about all you got. But unfortunately, his ability doesn't really do anything, and that's going to put him in the D tier because same issue with Chewbacca in that you're running this command, vigilance, heroism archetype, and Finn doesn't even take advantage of it by utilizing some of the ramp you get access to, and also doesn't have anything going for him as a leader, with the exception of just being a body, which you can get with Chewbacca, and you can get with some other options that are just a little bit better. Probably one of my favorite lists to have played in set 3 has been Gar Saxon Yellow. Now, there wasn't actually that many additions to the deck in Gar Saxon Yellow. It's just more of how his cards have shaped up in the meta. I do find him to be a somewhat B tier level deck, and we have seen a few Gar Saxon Yellow pop up here and there. Really, you have things that are shielded and they get bonuses just by being shielded, but also because they're shielded, they prevent your opponent from abusing Tarkin Town on you in every single scenario. And you also, in other matchups, are going to be finding yourself trading up because your shield token trades for their unit essentially, which is extremely powerful. Add to the fact that, well, you've got yourself just really strong early game units, 7th Fleet Defender being a 4/2 shielded, Dr. Evazan being a turn 1 4/3 shielded, even something like a Crafty Smuggler being a 3/2 shielded on turn 1. all of which just completely dominate the early game, and that's what oftentimes the meta seems to be about. Add a snapshot reflex to something later on, and suddenly you're getting +2/+1, assuming they don't have an upgrade already, and that's for one resource that allows you to immediately attack. That is absolutely absurd. You can turn into a very powerful aggro deck with Gar Saxon himself coming down as sort of just a way to get in a little bit more damage. As we've seen with a few of these different leaders, this is more of an aggro deck that you're going to outvalue your opponent in the early game and then just close out the game by the time you're flipping Gar Saxon, which is really quite powerful. Next up, we've got Grand Inquisitor, and unfortunately for this guy, I'm going to have to put him in the C tier. Now, Grand Inquisitor blue prior to the Tarkin Town meta would have probably entered into the B tier in the middle of the pack or so. But with the Tarkin Town meta, his ability to have damaged his own units to get some early game damage in completely wrecks him. If you're playing a more aggro deck, which is what Grand Inquisitor is trying to do, and you're playing these less valuable kind of really leading into damaging your own units to get in early damage strategy, you better be prepared. And unfortunately, you can't be prepared in the meta where your opponent just Tarkin Towns away your units. You can't actually get any damage in, and now you're stuck with these weird grit units that don't really do a whole lot because you can't damage them. Otherwise, you just completely give up your early game. And in some cases, your opponent doesn't even need to Tarkin Town them because there's so much random one damage things here and there. Cad Bane, Bossk with bounties. You've got Jango or P-38s or random nonsense going around. It's just he is in a bad place in the meta. And that's the tricky part about Grand Inquisitor. And add to the fact that he deploys so mediocre in a situation where you need a leader to deploy a little bit early or just a better stat line, he's just going to be a C tier. I mean, this guy just straight up dies to a Plo Koon, assuming he's got coordinate on that Plo Koon. Moff Gideon has always been a leader I have found reasonably weak. Now, I definitely could see an argument for this guy entering into the D tier, but we will see how the list shapes up as we go a little bit further. Moff Gideon Red is the list that I've seen out of all the Moff Gideon lists. I've seen a little bit of Moff Gideon Green. I've seen a little bit of other options, but Red is the list that I have seen to be somewhat synergistic with his ability. The problem is that his ability is early game focused, and well, your early game focused leader ability doesn't actually do enough compared to other early game leader abilities. You do get to run Tarkin Town, which is a nice bonus with Moff Gideon Red, but you oftentimes don't have the power in the leader or the leader ability to back up the early game competition. And because of all that, you're going to find him in the C tier. I think one of the big things is if you were able to attack the base, or rather just give your early game units with this ability the option to actually hit into the base for additional damage, not directly necessarily, but also just giving them overwhelm with the attack. I could see some options, right? Giving +1/+0 and overwhelm to actually get in some early game damage into the base. That could have some merit, but unfortunately, he just doesn't really do a whole lot and is going to end up in the C or D tier. Next up, we've got ourselves General Grievous Yellow. This one was a pretty tricky one because there's not really that many Grievous players out there. And so I kind of had to make an executive decision about Grievous. I've seen Grievous blues. I've seen where you're playing the double Grievous nonsense. I've also seen where you're playing like the Grievous Reds with Tarkin Town, but honestly, the best thing I've seen is just playing powerful double yellow cards in your deck, and that is Grievous Yellow. Playing Cunning is a good card, who knew? But realistically, there's not much going for Grievous as a leader and as a deck himself. You do get access to a few different things like Soulless one, which can be pretty strong, and as I said, you do get access to Cunning, which is a powerful card that can help you win some games. But realistically, this guy is pretty mediocre and unfortunately doesn't really have anything going for him either. You're going to find yourself pretty underpowered compared to a lot of the leaders that deploy a lot earlier than you. And also Grievous himself just even when he comes down, he's not offering you all that much. There's just not enough droid units to take advantage of his leader action, and there's just not enough payoffs, even if you were to take advantage of his leader action. Now we dive into some of the Hans, starting us off with Han 2 Blue. This is another one where you kind of suffer from Tarkin Town. Han, although quite a bit better than like Grand Inquisitor by dealing damage to your own units, just getting a resource discount, you've lost a lot of awesome options with this deck because of just how many random damage things are happening in the game. As such, I'm gonna have to put him at the B tier level, whereas previously I would have put him at like an S tier level. Han Blue does have some ability to compete and is still a reasonably solid deck. We are still seeing him put in a few lists, but definitely not as consistent and not as powerful as he was prior. Honestly, you could even put him somewhere behind some of these other B tier lists, but he does still have that consistency that I do like. If you're not fighting the Cad Reds or the Jangos or the Bosks, which are some of the top lists of the format, with all this direct damage, you are able to still leverage the additional power of playing things above curve. But for example, if you are going with the prior option of, I'm going to play my red 3 on turn 1, guess what? They're going to play a unit off Cad Bane and kill your unit. Turn 1, doing absolutely nothing but just playing on curve. Or they're going to play a P38 on turn 2, kill your turn 1 play for basically no cost to them at all. And that's what makes Han a lot weaker, because you really cannot take as much advantage out of this guy's leader ability as you were in prior sets. I'm sure this is a leader that we'll have to take a look on back when we go through some of these future sets to see if we're in a Tarkin Town meta, because regardless of just the damage pings, those decks oftentimes are running Tarkin Town, which means they can kill multiple of your early game plays, sending you too far back behind to actually compete. But it does do well against some other lists. It's just a matter of being in the wrong meta for Han Blue. Next up, we've got OG Han, and this is where it gets a little bit more exciting. This is where we've got to talk about some powerful lists. Starting us off, we've got 3 lists to talk about, and this is the only, I believe, leader that has 3 lists to talk about. And this is why we've been consistently talking about Han, because he's one of the only lists that is supplying multiple competitive options and are really putting up results. And these decks individually attack on kind of different angles, which is very, very interesting. Starting us off with Han Yellow, which is the best of the 3, pretty much with no competition. It is significantly better because it is the #1 list in terms of popularity, wins, and also power in general. It is privy to the tech DJ combo, as are all of these Han lists for the most part, but more specifically does not rely on the tech itself, can just play DJ as a 7-cost smuggle and is still really excellent at taking advantage of that. Couple that with the fact that you get access to Cunnings, you get access to Bodies, you get access to the double Cunning options that Han gives you, and you are just playing a disruptive tempo deck that really runs people over. You got so many things to work with ya with Han Yellow. But Han Green is really not that far behind. Just behind what I would put Anakin Blue. You could even put Han Green above him. But in terms of performance, Han Green does fall right behind Anakin Blue, but still really, really excellent. Can in some cases even put a more devastating tech DJ combo on ya because of the ramp capabilities. This one actually leverages the U-Wing reinforcements to go ahead and grab some other 7 resource plays that are out of aspect, such as Luke Skywalker. You get the ramp, which means you get the 7 drop even quicker in Han than you would in Han Yellow for the most part, which can be really, really quite powerful and overall just absolutely decimates you in a lot of games. And then we've got Han Red, which honestly is still above Cad Blue. Now I will say between Han Yellow and the Han Green, there is a significant drop off. Heck, even between like Han Yellow and Cad Red and Bossk Blue that we see up here in the S tier, as we start to fill out some more of those slots, you'll see a pretty big drop off. The difference between Han Green and Han Red is a pretty decent drop off as well. Han Red attacks as more of an aggressive situated position and really gets in a lot of damage, and even has some pretty spectacular smuggle options. Hot Shot Blaster is one of those that all decks can use, but I think Han Red really takes advantage of it. You also have access to things like K2SO, which is just direct damage. You've got access to basically that Han aggression, cunning heroism with arguably the best leader in the format right now, which we've talked about how strong that can be with like Fennec, Cassian, and Ahsoka. Well, guess what? Now you got Han leading it, and yes, he does it better. Kind of awkward leaving off one of the best leaders in the game, or best decks in the game, into one of the worst decks in the game in Hera Double Green. Now, Hera just really has never found a footing, mainly because her leader ability does nothing except give you access to some options that don't even really fit together. And the options that you have, you arguably could have played in other decks for more effective options. The best Spectre unit is the 2-cost Sabine unit. And many other decks that are running like Cunning, Aggression, Heroism are just running that unit. If you're playing Hera, you get access to things like Chopper, Zeb, Kanan, Ezra, all in the same deck. But realistically, Kanan and Sabine are the two that you really want to play. And then Ezra is a close option behind that. Maybe you want to play Spark of Rebellion, which is an event that works well in some decks, but not necessarily if you're just putting together the Phoenix squad. You do have the new Sabine unit, which is still not that amazing for you to have played a leader that does literally nothing but offer you the option to play those cards. Add to the fact that she deploys late with a weak stat line and an attack trigger that doesn't always activate to put experience tokens on. You just have one of, if not the worst decks in terms of overall effectiveness in the game. Next up, we've got one of the classics from set 2 in Hondo Blue. Now, Hondo Blue never really, in my mind, surpassed like a B tier, but I do find that in this new, very aggressively situated meta, especially with the Tech DJ combos running around, you're going to find Hondo has dropped a decent margin and honestly could probably be put at the bottom of C tier. Now, I've seen Hondo Greens, I've seen Hondo Yellows, I've seen Hondo Blues. I do find that Hondo Blue is the best way to take advantage of his smuggle option, or smuggle ability rather, but you can run all of these different ones and they're all kind of equally as viable. I just put a little bit of edge towards Hondo Blue. Honestly, you could argue that all three of these should be in D tier just because they really don't offer a whole lot. Hondo can do some work by smuggling out some things later on in the game, or even into like the mid game, getting you like 3/3 space units for a couple of resources. Like that can be okay, but overall, you just don't have the capability to go to that longer grind out style in the meta where you have Han Yellows, Tarkin Town decks, and things like that absolutely running you over. And if you've seen any of my videos recently in tier list, or even just me playing Hunter, I believe this guy to be the literal worst leader in the game. He deploys extremely late, giving you no room to breathe. He has an action that not only costs resources for you to draw a card, but the way you draw a card requires so much setup to the point where you're not ever really doing it. And even if you were to pull it off, the card that you draw is something that you don't really want to draw because it's one that reflects in the game right now being a unique unit where you're doubling up on them, all of which are just horrible. Yes, he has an okay stat line, but honestly, even then is a little bit pushy, and you just don't really have any advantage coming out from Hunter. Like, yes, you can play the aggression, command, heroism deck, but to be honest, even with Tarkin Town, you just don't have the ability to go all the way. One of the reasons as to why cunning aggression heroism or command aggression heroism works as well as it does is because you get out real nice and early, have that rebel package, and your leader provides just enough, or in some cases a lot, to the where you are able to cross the finish line. Hunter doesn't have that, and because of that, even if you are playing the aggression command heroism archetype, you are just playing a bad deck and probably should just never be playing this guy. Iden Blue is next up and probably number 2 in terms of what we offer for hard control lists. This does do some work and actually has performed relatively recently in the overall meta, and for that reason I think it's worth probably a tier spot, and I would actually put her just above the Cad Bane Blue that we've seen. This one does have access to 4 cost vigilances, and guess what? That's still very, very powerful. Playing command, or rather villainy vigilance, is just overall strong. You get access to some of the most powerful removal options. You get access to something like Childson, which is a 6/6 coming down as a sentinel on turn 3. You get access to Super Laser Blasts and Avengers, which are some of the most powerful late game control options. And you're healing, and that's pretty good for a leader that wants to end up in that spot. I do find her significantly more weak than like a Bossk Blue because you just don't have the proactive control that Bossk is doing. It's much more reactive because you're really only doing something if your opponent is not only playing units, but kind of playing into what you are doing. You must be defeating units, you must be healing, and you must be playing a lot of resources, or rather a lot of events that only work when your opponent plays certain things, whereas Bossk can kind of just play off of whatever your opponent plays, deploy early, and actually turn into quite the, well, powerhouse in terms of having a lot of power on the board, and that's what gives Bossk a significant edge over another hard control deck like Iden. Another leader that I have just never really seen do a whole lot of work, IG-88. This is another one that has really been susceptible to the meta as of late. In set 2, I could easily see him being bumped up into the C tier in terms of like the high C tier. Playing a bunch of units early, a bunch of 1 toughness units, and just aggroing out your opponent and getting down the board is really strong. But with the new Tarkin Town / I'm going to just deal a bunch of damage to all your early game units, or Bossk in the meta, or just outvaluing you with Han Yellows, or even Bossk Greens coming in and double claiming their bounties with a couple of your cheap, really, really low toughness units, or even P38s being in the meta, even across decks that aren't running Tarkin Town. You just got way too many things to deal with, to the point where IG going wide, taking advantage of his action, and then eventually taking advantage of IG is just too weak. The toughness on IG is too low, the ability to go wide and take advantage of his action is too weak, and overall you're just in a meta where you're not going to see all that much value from IG-88. Next up, we dive into one of the more disappointing leaders as I found in Jabba the Hutt. This is another one in which you really, really feel the pain when you are trying to use all these actions and try to set up in a meta where your opponents can kind of just set up by just playing out their cards in a single action. That really hinders Jabba's performance. And while I think the overall synergy and power level can be very powerful, it still falls short to the point where it's probably got to enter C tier, because I think the overall deck archetype just falls flat when you compare it to like the cunning aggression heroism, which we've talked so much about, when we compare it to like the triple dark raids, or just the overall synergy that a few of these other lists have. You do and can perform some powerful things like playing oversteaded units on turn 1, or even getting like free value by playing your units that supposedly want bounties. But the problem with that, even if you are doing that, yes, you played oversteaded units, but they usually all just die to Tarkin Town anyways, and you still are late to deploy, your synergies are more mid to late game focused synergies, and all of that is looking pretty bad when you're looking at a more aggressive meta. And of course, I just moved the screen down for you guys because I'm raging at Jabba. And next up, we get to talk about a powerhouse, one of the S tier lists. And I think it comes to no surprise, as we've been talking about Jango alongside a lot of these S tier lists since very early on into set 3. But we actually have 2 Jango lists to talk about. Now, Jango Red is going to be immediately slotted up into the S tier. I do find not only its results reflected in terms of what it's capable of performing, but also just overall where it's situated as a deck really performs well. Jango Red being that triple dark raid full space strategy for the most part, with exhaust opportunities in the ground and with your units in general, is just a very powerful thing to be doing. Jango himself as a tempo-based leader, really preventing your opponents who are playing these more higher value units early on being just targeting town away, or into the mid game where they're just unable to attack due to the exhaustion, is just a really powerful thing to do. But then we talk about Jango Green, and this is where it gets a little bit more interesting because it is something that does have a lot going for it. The question is, what is it doing outside of the typical Jango thing? Is it still going with that tempo game plan, or is it doing something a little bit different? Well, we do have a little bit of exhaust potential, playing early game units and things like ISB agent, Crumb, or things like that to go ahead and exhaust your opponent and do some damage, right? But unlike Jango, where it's exhausting and taking over the early game to where your opponent can't recover and the game is ended, Jango is stalling to end the game in a different way, which is Darth Vader's, Maul's, and potentially late game explosion that command villainy tends to offer. As such, he's still quite strong. I would definitely put him into that A tier category, but is definitely not nearly as strong as the S tier options above it, and heck, does have a significant drop off, in my opinion, to your Han Reds and Han Greens, but still quite a powerful list to contend with. Next up, we've got a leader that falls into the cunning, aggression, heroism archetype and gets to run Tarkin Town, but I find to be quite a bit weaker than the other 3. And it's mainly because while Ahsoka does have some options and deploys a turn early compared to Cassian or Jin, Fennec does deploy earlier than Cassian and Jin and has probably the most useful ability. Cassian, drawing a couple cards here and there, actually does come in handy, and has Saboteur when he deploys, which means most likely to get in an attack. Jin, on the other hand, does not have Saboteur, deploys later like Cassian, and her action does not help at all realistically with the strategy that you're trying to go with in cunning, aggression, heroism, which is the aggro plan. Therefore, I'm going to put her a couple of tiers lower than our good friends Fennec, Cassian, and Ahsoka. I do find that just that deck archetype still warrants a little bit higher than some of the bottom C tier and some of the D tier lists, but not quite enough to put her in the B tier. Next up, we've got a good one in Director Krennic, which is one of those soft control lists that has popped up here and there. Director Krennic really, with ECL and also 30 HP to be honest, has done a decent amount of work. It is a pretty strong soft control list and does get backed up by the fact that you do have Restore 2 on a 5 to deploy leader, giving you options to run that ECL to make up for that 5 HP loss, while also actually applying a little bit of board presence and being able to finish out the game with your classic command villainy cards like Darth Vader, Reinforcement Walker, and eventually Avengers. This one is more of that soft control list, so you are still deploying to the board to compete, unlike your Iden blues, which are kind of more event-based and not playing as many units, Director Krennic does get access to ramp as well. So resupplies and super laser technicians, which is really nice when your payoffs are Darth Vader and Maul and reinforcement walker, etc. So you actually can attack on a few different axes than something like an Iden blue, which kind of similar, or like a Cad Bane blue, which is probably more similar because this is more of a soft control deck as well. I do find Krennic to be just a little bit more powerful because you do get access to the command villainy options, which are quite strong. Next up, we've got one of my favorite all-time lists in double red Kylo. And this one might surprise you, but I'm going to be dropping Kylo into the A tier just above Cad Bane blue. It's kind of on that same tier where you could put Cad Bane above Kylo and Kylo above Cad Bane. I'm going to be a little bit biased here and say, okay, I'm going to put Kylo just above Cad Bane blue because it actually has performed very similarly to Cad Bane blue, but also has a very different dynamic on which it's attacking compared to basically all the other lists here. One other list that might be a little bit similar is Asajj, but even then it doesn't quite come as close because Asajj is generally attacking in the space where Kylo double red is going all out aggro, similar to what IG would be doing, but a very different way, which is going all in instead of having to go wide and force yourself to have those units to actually get in damage. You're kind of just sacrificing all your units, just pump as much damage as you possibly can, and then you have Kylo to come down early and close out the game with a significant amount of power. Generally on turn 3, you're getting him deployed with 4 or 5 power. You add a fallen lightsaber onto that, and you are just attacking for massive chunks of damage. There are some decks that just cannot keep up. There are just so many different units that Kylo can deploy, especially with Mr. Bones here coming out. Yes, it still has those 1 toughness units, and yes, it still struggles against Cad Reds and Jango Reds, like I mentioned with IG. The difference in a single turn of deploying is the difference maker here between something like an IG and something like Kylo, or even something like an Asajj or something like a Kylo. Whereas Asajj, yes, she deploys a turn early. It's even a matter of power difference, right? That 1 extra power or 2 extra power that Kylo can pump out just because of a leader, and also his front side action, which can get in a couple of extra points of damage, and the ability to play double red tends to favor Kylo just a little bit. Aggression is a very strong card, and yes, you get to play it in double red Kylo. Next up, we've got Lando, and Lando Yellow is the deck I've seen the most, and I do not find it to be very powerful at all. I know this one might actually be just slightly controversial. I know some people are Lando enjoyers. I could put him in the C tier, but honestly, I view him as worthy of the D tier. And if I'm going to put Lando in the D tier, I feel like I should put Moff in the D tier as well, because I don't find Moff Gideon to be stronger than the Lando decks out there, because Lando still gets to play cunning. It still has some powerful things it can do, like smuggling out a Millennium Falcon quite a bit earlier, but it doesn't have nearly anything going for it besides that. I think this is a symptom of just not having enough viable smuggle options. One of the big things with Lando was that you got access to smuggle cards earlier, but the smuggle cards that were created were cards that were very overcosted because you had the ability to play it from your resource pile. Therefore, yes, you get a resource cost reduction, and yes, you can play it from your resource pile, but you're kind of getting on par units and things like you get access to for that reduction in cost, which is not what you want with a Lando. Next up, we've got a list that I'm honestly surprised we have not seen more of in Leia Red. And I'll always say this every single time we talk about Leia Red. This is a list that was the very first list I made a video on this channel, so it's got a special spot in my heart, but still has not been able to compete. And while I do find the aggression heroism specific aspect combination to be strong. This one does get access to Tarkin Town. I don't find Leia to be particularly strong, especially with her action as of late, because oftentimes all the early game aggressors can really handle your early game units, and you get minimal to no value out of Leia. And while I do think the deck is reasonably strong at its core, I would put it behind the cunning, aggression, heroism archetype right now, because they get access to some powerful cards and get access to a more powerful leader, generally speaking, which is something I didn't think I'd be saying with Fennec and with Cassian, but it's just a matter of really not being able to utilize her action and really not being able to utilize her flip side either. Next up, we've got an old classic, one of the OGs of set 1 in Luke Green. And this guy has definitely flown under the radar in terms of, I just seen absolutely no one talking about this guy since set 1, really. I think I did one video on him in set 2 because I found him to be reasonably okay, and he still is reasonably okay. I would put him just in that B tier range, but I honestly would put Boba and Gar Saxon above Luke, which is not something I would be saying. And honestly, I should probably put him behind Asajj even. I do find him as a leader to be just strong enough to beat out the base level command, or rather cunning, aggression, heroism archetype, because the shield tokens are relevant, and if you do get that early game alliance dispatcher, that can really amp up your overall game plan. It's one of the few leaders that can really take advantage of that. However, being able to have all these random 1 damage here, 1 damage there abilities or units or whatnot really hinder the shield tokens in the cases of like Cad or Jango. And then of course him deploying just a little bit later at 6 resources can hinder it as well. Even though you do have ramp options in command, you just aren't able to hold on quite long enough to take advantage of U-wing reinforcements and home ones and all that type of stuff very frequently. I have noticed that Luke Green generally is playing ECL these days over the 30 HP base, which is what we were doing in the set 2, and that's probably just a symptom of having access to some good things to ECL out, as well as, well, you just need a little bit more to compete with the early game than before. Next one up, we've got Mace Windu, and this one's been a little bit surprising, to be honest. He has performed quite well. I mentioned this when I did my Mace Windu video, and I never ended up doing a Mace Windu Blue video, so I apologize for that one. We just got distracted by so many other things. But Mace Windu Blue was the archetype that I had found way more success with than the double red Mace Windu, which we had played and a lot of people were commenting on. It was only after the PQ where Mace Windu Blue really popped up that people started playing him a lot more. And mind you, he has put up results comparable to things like Asajj Red. In fact, even superior. And as a result, I feel, and I have played Mace Windu Blue, that I would actually prefer to take a Mace Windu Blue than an Asajj Red if I was looking to actually win more games. Mace Windu Blue attacks at an angle where you're playing this sort of hard control deck, more leaning towards the hard control than soft control, because you are just playing all these random events and you're playing all these early game, not early game units, but all these units that stack up well with Mace Windu. You take Mace Windu down and you put him down and he acts as like sort of a Wrath, sort of a super laser blast in a lot of situations, because you've dealt all these 1 damage here, 1 damage there, and you can kind of wipe the board, and then you use that to transition into Luke's, Zillo Beasts, or Crate Dragons to close out the game. It's actually pretty decent, and I definitely found him to be more impressive the more I used him in these more controlling games. On another note, another leader that we really haven't seen too much of, the Mandalorian. Mandalorian's going to drop down into the C tier. I think this is a leader where I'm actually really excited about with set 4, because one of the big issues with this overall concept of playing upgrades to exhaust your opponent's units is that you need units and you need upgrades. And oftentimes you need to compete in the space arena, and your upgrades do not work on your vehicles. And if you're competing in the space arena to contend with the space decks, you suddenly can't take advantage of the Mandalorian's ability all that often, and you have a lot of dead draws because the upgrades can only be applied to units. But if you're playing only in the units and you're upgrading those units, your opponent can really mess up your strategy by exhausting just a single unit for multiple turns. Whereas, yes, you may have exhausted one of theirs, but that's just one of their units. Well, all of your resources are going on to one unit, whereas their units are resources are split up against multiple units. All of these kind of impact Mandalorian pretty poorly. When we get the option to have upgrades that can be played as units and upgrades that can be played as vehicles, so you can actually contend in the space arena, then we have some options. And I think it could get a little bit better, but definitely a symptom of really just awkward deck building. I know some people are really looking forward to Maul being pretty good, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to put Maul kind of in that same tier of Mando or Aphra around here. He has just been increasingly unimpressive. You're playing the aggression, command, villainy archetype with overwhelming barrages and Kylo Rens and Palpatines and all that good stuff. And you got a little bit of ramp, and you do have a high-powered leader when he deploys. Problem is, 6 toughness is actually really bad in the format. I've talked a lot about aggression, cunning, heroism, and as I've mentioned many times, Plo Koon is a core deck building option, and oftentimes is played at least 2 or 3 of in all of these decks, as well as Boba, as well as Hans, all across the board, and this guy just dies to it, right? Add to the fact that Poe Dameron kills it, and just a bunch of other different units just straight up kill Maul. That's 6 toughness when you're deploying on 6 resources, a really big hindrance to where you actually oftentimes cannot take advantage of it. And his ability doesn't really do anything because the whole deck is more about getting Maul down rather than actually taking advantage of early game high power units that you can overwhelm through your opponent, which doesn't really happen either. He just doesn't really have anything going for him in the front side to bring him to the backside, and his backside isn't good enough to actually go ahead and finish out the game. And so unfortunately, he's going to end up into the C tier. And I know I started with Nala saying in the D tier when I first evaluated her. I brought her up into the C tier because I was being generous and I could see the potential, but we still have yet to see any real kind of list come out from Nala Say, and it's because she just doesn't offer all that much, okay? Being able to play clones in your deck, just similar to Hera, why? Yes, there are some powerful clones like Wrecker, but it doesn't fit the Nala Say vigilance, villainy core that she is. Yes, you can dive into some other clones, and yes, there are some that are reasonable, but again, similar to Hera, there are so many just better things. If I were to play a Nala Se deck that's vigilance, villainy, command, I think I could build a better one without the clones than with the clones, generally speaking. And so her as a leader doesn't offer anything. Her flip side, yes, it's an early deploy. Yes, it can be a 1/7, I guess. And yes, you can heal a little bit if you got clones. It doesn't do anything, really, though. You don't really get the clones dying, and you don't really heal anything. And the Nala Se just dies because she doesn't apply any board presence because her stat line's so poor. So, to me, this is a list that when I see Nala Se on the opposite side of the battlefield, it is just like, oh, yeah, that's a free win. Nute is another one where I felt like had potential but did not really live up to it. There's just too many actions involved trying to get your battle droids returning to you. Exploit is just really easily beaten. There's not enough powerful exploit cards alongside exploit support to where exploit as a mechanic hasn't really lifted off. And this later is built all around it. He deploys with a really kind of awkward stat line, and the reason being is that you're generating these battle droid tokens, and you're supposed to use these battle droid tokens to give you big, expensive things on the battlefield. There's not enough of them, and there's not a deck that really supports this, even with like Nute Yellow, with Geonosis Patrol Fighter, or things like your Malevolence and big things that can come down. It just doesn't really work all that well, and unfortunately, it has never really gotten off the D/C tier area. Obi-Wan, next one up. I know a lot of people like Obi Green, and I do find it to be a little bit better than initially thought, but still pretty weak in general. I still find him to be a C tier list. He has performed better than I thought he would, but not by much. I think previously I would have put him in the mid to bottom of C tier. He's going to end up in the high C tier. He has performed somewhat. Like, he's gotten, I think, 1 top 8 overall, which is kind of cool. But overall, as a deck, it does not even come close to the archetypes that we see above, or just the leader potential. Obi-Wan, the best thing he has going for him is that he has a good matchup into some of the ping-based decks. And that's not even like a good matchup. And what I mean by that is, yes, your ability theoretically counteracts like Cad Bane, but in reality, the deck is just so much weaker in terms of the cards that you're playing and the synergies that you have, that Cad Bane still has a good matchup into you. And that's unfortunate. Yes, you can do a little bit better against some specific decks, which puts them a little bit closer to the C tier, but not good enough to actually carry you through into the B tier. You want to talk about a pretty weak leader? Well, I'm going to talk about Padme. Double green Padme is the one I chose, and that's about as good as I could get it. Still D tier. Her action of forcing you to have coordinate, being forced to pay a resource, and then only searching a few cards for a Republic option, all of which not paying you off, too expensive and too hard to set up. You can deploy her for an early body with a restoring body, which is okay, but that's about all she's really offering is her stat line. She's not really offering anything else, and oftentimes it's a bait to even use her ability, but her stat line isn't good enough to pull her out of the D tier. If it was Restore 2, I could absolutely see her as like a C tier list. It's a difference between Restore 1 and Restore 2. Because it's Restore 1, I find her to be incredibly weak to the point where I have just seen very little value, very little performance from her overall. I'll say one of the lists I did not expect coming out of set 3 was New Palp or Palpatine 3 Red. This is a list that's all about Tarkin Town as well and dominating the space arena. It's not amazing. It does have a kind of a one-track mind and really doesn't do it extremely consistently because you are relying on your opponent not really knowing how to play around a Palpatine as a leader, because you generally will not want to go into the late game, so you can't pass to play around your opponent, but your opponent can wait to see what you play and then play around that. If the game goes longer, your opponent's just inching its way closer, assuming there's been no plays made, to their leader while you're not doing anything. So you can't really sit there and play around your opponent's plays. Your opponent gets to have the information and they can force you in a situation where you can't really take advantage of Palpatine's flipping back and forth, and then you don't have a leader, and that can be pretty weak. As such, I think it kind of puts itself into the C tier, but it's a reasonably high C tier list to where you're going to find it kind of above the Leias. It still is playing cunning, heroism, aggression, but you don't have a leader, and that's a big downside in some matchups. But now we switch gears from talking about new Palp to the old Palp, an OG, and quite a strong one at that. One of the best things that Palpatine has going for him is that when you flip this guy, it is immediately shifted into your favor for the most part. Being able to steal a damaged unit, even if it's a poor one, just gives you so much equity in the game. Not to mention you have a 410 body, which is still quite obnoxious to deal with. It is just really, really quite strong. And I've noticed this one resource action to be very, very applicable in most games. In fact, Palpatine's action is one of those actions that I use surprisingly more than a lot of other actions on this list, which you would be surprised. Palpatine Yellow is a decent chunk better than double green Palpatine. I think mainly because you get access to a couple of decent cunning cards like P38 especially. Another great one is Change of Heart, being able to steal your opponent's units, maybe even kill their other unit with that unit and then sacrifice that unit is such an insane value play for 6, oftentimes 7 resources that you can just win the game on the spot. But overall, this does have some more tools to deal with the mid to early game and actually payoffs in the late game, whereas double green Palp is more focused on pure ramp, which is still solid, but not quite as solid as the Palp yellow. But I would put double green Palp in the A tier as well. Palpatine as a leader, because you're ramping and you have an immediate payoff every single time that shifts the board into your favor, is important. One of the problems with some of these other late game decks is that you don't have something like Palpatine to immediately take board control. The hard control lists just get to the late game by controlling the board at every time. The Palpatine lists kind of ignore it and then just ramp and then dominate you. I will say double yellow Han is a really tricky matchup for this deck, and it's one of the reasons why it's not higher, because it's the most played deck in the format. Next up, we've got another soft control list, very, very similar to Krennic, but performs remarkably better than Krennic in terms of results, and that's going to be Qi'ra. Qi'ra is going to go into the A tier, also another soft control list that performs exceptionally well due to the standard vigilance command villainy archetype that we have grown so used to with Darth Vader's, Avengers, Snoke's, Power of the Dark Side, controlling the game plan, and then getting to the later stages of the game. One of the things about Qi'ra that I think really allows her to win a lot more matchups is the ability to flip and become like this board wipe event that hits a bunch of units, allows a lot of your other units to trade with them, or having Qi'ra and those other units trade up because of the way her ability works of dealing half that HP damage, which can be really powerful. Heck, even if you're fighting something like Jango, for example, if they flip Jango and you flip Qi'ra, suddenly you're killing Jango and you're left with a 7-1 behind. That can put a lot of pressure on, surprising amounts of pressure that people aren't necessarily used to. There is a little bit of value with her action, but for the most part, I actually find her flip to be one of the most impactful things about Qi'ra in general. And next, we get to talk about one of the up-and-comers alongside Jango Fett in Quinlan. Now, Quinlan Red is by far the superior list, and that is mainly because of the Tarkin Town meta, where you're able to control the early game but just by playing units. And guess what? This is another cunning, aggression, heroism archetype, which I've talked so much about. This is probably the best user of that archetype, but we already see some leaders with some pretty mediocre abilities like Ahsoka or Cassian in the B tier. As a result, Quinlan, who can take full advantage of it, jumps up into the S tier as one of the top 3 decks as of right now in our list, but more often probably a top 5 list in the meta. You're able to leverage those Plo Koons to potentially deal 7 damage as an ambusher to things like Jango, which can be really powerful, assuming you have coordinate. You have a little bit of force synergy. You get to play the cunning, aggression, heroism, aggro, rebel package. You get to play things like Millennium Falcon, which are extremely strong, some disruptive elements that are extremely strong. This is the archetype kind of leader in the cunning, aggression, heroism space. Quinlan is excellent, but it's not too far behind in its green form, command form. I should say it's far behind, but not like unplayable, because it's actually a deck worthy of the A tier. And I would actually put it above Kylo and Palpatine. Quinlan, this is Quinlan ECL, and this is just playing, again, the cunning, aggression core of Plo Koons, Millennium Falcons, things like that. You get to back that up with Battlefield Marines, and what's cool about this is you can oftentimes go ECL post Plo Koon or before Plo Koon, to where you have multiple ambushers in a row, which can be really devastating to deal with and can completely control the game. Tarkin Town is significantly better, I'd say, in this list than ECL. ECL really works well with Podamarines and Wreckers. You don't quite have as impressive of threats, but there are things like Ahsoka that can be ECL'd out, or Ayla, which can be ECL'd out and can dominate a game. So there are still some powerful threats, and still a very solid deck and worthy of being on the list with another Quinlan deck. But still, going to be an A tier. And I know we've got Rex, and I know Rex is a lot of your favorites. And I know I'm going to be hurting some feelings with this one, but he is not that great. Okay? He is not that great. He is going to be ending up into the C tier. I think the best thing about Rex is this idea of being able to supply 2 bodies on the Rex flip, which works really well with some specific things. Triggering Coordinate and then Admiral Ackbar. Admiral Ackbar is one of the best cards in the deck, but here's the problem with Rex is a lot of people know what you're trying to do with Rex, and it's easy to take out a lot of the side units. And if you're able to kind of whittle down some of the side units, the ECL Ayla doesn't really do a whole lot. The Admiral Ackbar doesn't have as big of an impact. The Ewing reinforcements coming down later can't just immediately build you an insurmountable board, and you're not able to get as much value out of Rex himself. There are some things you can do to mitigate this with Captain Rex, but realistically, he's going to be a C tier list for us. Rey Red is a pretty interesting one. It is very similar to the Anakin Blue that we see out in the wild, but attacks on a little bit of a different angle. It is an exceptional deck, and I do find it to be one of the better decks in the format. It is an A tier list for me. Anakin Blue, it's all about that early game units that can get just this massive value swings in by keeping themselves alive but killing your unit. Rey, on the other hand, does something a little bit different where it grows their units outside of range of Tarkin Town and outside of range of some of the other opposing units, but at the same time has Tarkin Town of their own to compete. And Rey, when she flips, it's not a win con necessarily. It's actually a way to keep you in the game longer. Whereas Anakin kind of comes out and is just an end game win con, Rey comes down and starts to restore every single turn. So if you haven't dealt with her, or if you haven't kind of gotten them to low HP before Rey comes out, Rey can really put you back in the game, and you can start to win with Lukes, Crate Dragons, and things like that. These lists almost always have very similar lists where you're playing the same sort of deck. It's just a different leader involving way different play styles in Rey versus Anakin. And I know you all have been waiting for this one. We've got Sabine. This one's going to be an immediate S tier, number 2 deck of the format, Sabine Green. Now, what's interesting is I've talked a lot about the aggression, cunning, heroism archetype. And one of the reasons why that is so particularly strong is because you kind of have things that work on their own. Aggression command heroism is really forced into something that needs ECL, which is why we see Anakin run ECL and when I see Sabine run ECL. The nice thing about Sabine is that she is able to leverage this perfectly because she comes down early, which means the best aggression ECL targets aren't affecting her as much. And those aggression ECL targets are extremely aggressive on their own right. So she comes down, applies a ton of damage. She has that rebel aggro package that we're so used to. We have direct damage in Sabine herself. And then she follows that up with things that can completely annihilate your mid game and your ability to recover by ECing out things like K2SO, Podameron, or Wrecker, which can be really powerful. But we actually have another list to talk about, and that is Sabine Yellow. And I do find this list to be pretty interesting and worthwhile because I do find it to be quite solid. And I would put her probably in the top of B tier, actually, Sabine Yellow, that is. So she is that command, or rather aggression, cunning, heroism archetype. You get to use Plo Koons and all that good stuff, and she is a great user of it. However, you'll notice that the 2 above her are both Tarkin Town users, and in general, the Tarkin Town users are slightly higher than the non-Tarkin Town users, and that's because Tarkin Town as a base just gives you so much more early game options and competition. The reason why she's still in the B tier is a testament to Sabine herself, and she fits perfectly within that aggressive archetype, coming down early and pumping in damage. Sabine Green is the true scary threat, however, and this is one that's going to always seem to be top of the meta because of how consistent her aggro options seem to be. But we are nearing the end of our list, and we've got Tarkin as the next one up. This one's pretty interesting because Tarkin has appeared here and there as a list that people are using, but Tarkin Yellow has kind of fallen off the face of the earth. It is really Tarkin Blue that has come up in its place. I do not find this list to be particularly amazing, but it is reasonable. And for that, I think I'm going to slot it into the B tier. You still have the options to play these Imperial cards and get them pumped up with experience. And getting down Tarkin early and getting those experience tokens flowing can really cause some problems. And I do like the vigilance added to this, because what it allows you to do is kind of control the board a little bit better, so that your units that are being pumped up get to have that ability to be pumped up, so your opponent's units can't deal with them, and they must deal with them not through combat, but rather through interaction. And a lot of decks aren't playing the interaction that can deal with Tarkin, and that's the dynamic that it gets to kind of win some games. But it's not particularly strong. It's not a list that I would recommend running, and I don't think it was as well situated as like Tarkin Yellow in the previous set. So it's going to be bottom of the B tier for me here. And we've got to move on to the next one, which is Thrawn Blue. And unfortunately for my Thrawn lovers like myself out there, this guy's got to go down into the C tier. I'm actually going to put him below Jin, because I just find Jin's archetype to be more consistent and stronger in an average game. As such, I believe Nute and probably double yellow Grievous are worthy of the D tier. We will see if this changes at all, but Thrawn himself, he just pays to stall out the game, and that's not good enough. You can't be paying resources to stall out the game, because your recovery mechanism is so late in the game that you cannot compete with opponents putting out things that are immediately readied up, getting their leaders down even, or just flooding the board with a lot of things while you're wasting time using your action. It can give you some information, which is nice, and that can lead you into just playing a solid control game. But in that case, you're just weaker, because your Thrawn comes down a little bit later, not with an aggressive stat line, so you can't actually kill off units. And on top of all that, you're not playing command vigilance villainy or double vigilance villainy, which really accesses a lot of options, or even aggression vigilance villainy for more control options. To me, it's very similar to Dr. Aphra, but Dr. Aphra has the advantage of having a really good matchup against control decks, which Thrawn doesn't necessarily have. Next up, we've got Vader Green, and this is Vader ECL, and you'll be happy to hear he is not below the B tier, but he is not high into the B tier. I would definitely compare this guy to Luke, and it's seemingly fitting to put Luke and Vader next to each other from set 1. But Vader kind of attacks on a similar axis to Luke. You're getting a little bit of extra value. You're putting in extra resources either into damaging your opponent's units, or in Luke's case, shielding. You're getting that little bit of value trading in your units. You are ramping a little bit to a powerful leader that's going to probably push you into the position where you might be able to win. In Darth Vader's case, you are also playing villainy command, which is a little bit stronger than heroism command in my opinion. You've got overwhelming barrage, you have super laser technician, which is additional ramp, which are two core elements that really Luke Green does not have access to, which is why I'm going to put him a little bit above. He is still decent, and Vader is a powerful leader to be ramping to, right? Coming down, being able to kind of clear up the board as just a leader is pretty powerful. And so I will give the edge to Vader, and I think he is still quite a decent deck. You're still able to ramp, and you're still able to do the Crate Dragon thing because you're playing aggression, but the meta is a lot more early game focused, and that hinders Vader quite a bit. Next up, we got Pre-Vizsla, and this is one that I think is quite interesting. Now, we've actually seen more Pre-Vizsla blues in the top 8, but I've seen more Pre-Vizsla reds out in the wild and in general. Those ones are kind of weird. This deck in general is weird. I don't find it to be very powerful. This is kind of like a weird, I'm kind of just randomly winning a game. But Pre-Vizsla does have some cool things going for it to make it be pushed into the C tier, kind of in the middle of the pack in the C tier. With double red, you get access to Shadow Collective Cam, which can kind of draw you into the potential 6/6 that he can be on 5 resources. Generally speaking, you're just getting the Saboteur, and that can be nice. And if you are playing some cards that can trigger the draw, you can get some pings with Pre-Vizsla. But honestly, The thing that I found to be pretty good with him is the fact that you can get him up to 6 power while playing cards that you do actually want to play in his deck, and that can be pretty nice on a 5 to deploy leader. Wat Tambor is the next one up, and we got Wat Tambor Red. This is the list that I also played for a video, and this is one that's just going to go wide. You take advantage of, you have a bunch of units, you're getting in damage, your opponent is forced to deal with those units because you're going wide, which means that they are not going to be able to race you. In doing so, you are racing them by using your actions, or you can just trade off, right? You get a bunch of 3/1s that can come down on turn 1, you trade off with them, suddenly you pump up your other unit, you're racing them, and they don't have any units to really race you with. Wat Tambor comes down, you can potentially get +4/+4 in terms of just his ability and action, which can be pretty nice. All that said, he still go wide deck, still has very similar problems to IG, and also isn't quite as powerful or consistent as like Kylo, and therefore you're gonna have to put him in the C tier, and I'm gonna have to drop Hondo Blue into the D tier. I'm gonna try to keep only 2 rows in each tier because I think that's more clean, but also I think it's very debatable as to whether or not Hondo should be in D tier in the first place. But Wat Tambor ending up into the C tier. And our very last list to I'll talk about, we've got Yoda. Now Yoda actually has a lot of different decks that have shown up, but not in a lot of games, right? We see Yoda greens, we see double blue Yodas, we see Yoda yellows, but Yoda red is actually the one that we see the most, and it makes sense because you're playing a very similar force synergy package that is decently strong, to be honest, and it definitely warrants a B tier placing, definitely above Asajj, as it really does have a very solid late game plan with Yoda and of course the overall strategy that you're playing. But Yoda red, this is one of the few lists that's playing aggression at its secondary base that's not oftentimes running Tarkin Town. It is extremely powerful. It is something that can really mess you up if you are going with that force plan with force throws, but also Yoda as a leader can just clear the board a little bit and prevent you from dying by restoring up. So it's actually quite strong. And then for that reason, we're going to drop him into the B tier. But zooming out here, this is going to give us the overview of today's tier list. And I'll say this is kind of how I would generally structure my tier list, trying to have sort of an even placing in each category, only having so many slots, because to me, if there is a deck that is better, then that should represent the A tier, and then the B tier are decks that are proportionally worse than the ones above it in a lot of situations, right? And that's why I think I generally put a few amount of S tier, usually top 5, top 6 around that mark for really the meta decks, and there's a big drop off for A tier, and then each category kind of has a similar amount, with D tier having a little bit less, because these are the leaders that are just horrible. Okay, just try not to play them. Like, they don't give that much value in today's meta, or they just got nothing going on for them for multiple sets and whatnot. There are a few placements that, especially based on planetary qualifiers and overviewing the set 3 meta, have shifted drastically, and that is why I am doing this for an updated list on every single deck list that you will oftentimes see. Now, of course, there's not every single one. People are going to be like, well, why don't you have X deck like Cad Bane red in here, and you have Cad Bane green in here, but you have Cad Bane blue? It's because Cad Bane blue and Cad Bane green have similar showings, but Cad Bane green's kind of split up between 2 slightly varianted Cad Bane green decks, whereas Cad Bane blue is more consistently the same. And I wanted to pull important lists that are associated with that leader, the best ones that are associated with that leader. Because obviously, if you wanted to expand this list, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, if you wanted to go past just me saying I want one deck list for each leader minimum, and then pull the important ones from each leader, you could also include Anakin yellows, double blue Yodas. You could be including Yoda greens. You could be including your Iden yellows, and like all the various different archetypes that pop up, just like 1 or 2 of here and there, and are all over the place. But to me, these are the lists that are kind of situated itself in the meta and are ones worth looking at Yes, there's going to be more. And yes, there's worthwhile ones talking outside of these. But these are kind of what I think about when I think of the overall meta of Star Wars Unlimited. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.